Live from London, this is BBC News. A new world order as Donald Trump announces sweeping new tariffs on all imports into the US. We have correspondents in Washington, Delhi, London and Paris as we assess the fallout from the president's dramatic announcement. Well, on today's programme, we'll have reaction, we'll look at the retaliation being planned and gauge the impact on markets, jobs and prices. Our other main headlines. Hamas rejects the latest Israeli ceasefire proposal, preferring instead a plan put forward by Egypt and Qatar. And with MPs still considering whether to legalise assisted dying in England and Wales, we have a special report looking at how the law works in California. Hello and welcome to BBC News. Let's start with those extraordinary events at the White House, with Donald Trump introducing sweeping new tariffs on all imports into the United States. President Trump claimed that America had been ripped off by foreigners for decades. Governments and businesses around the world are now taking stock. Retaliation is already being planned in many capitals. So let's start this out with a look at the headline figures here. There'll be a universal baseline tariff of 10% on all imports coming in to the US. That's the rate that will be imposed on the UK. The European Union has been hit with a higher 20% tariff. Donald Trump imposed an additional 34% tariff on China. That's on top of the 20% that has been announced. Well, he signed the executive order in the White House Rose Garden and described it as Liberation Day.
For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, we have a lot of them here with us today. They really suffered gravely. They watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream. We had an American dream that you don't hear so much about. You did 4 years ago. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore.
We will get the latest from Delhi, from Johannesburg, Paris and here in London in a moment or two. But let's start there in Washington to my colleague Katrina Perry. She's there at the White House. And Katrina, it was extraordinary to hear the president there talking about so many of his trading partners and allies in the way he did.
Absolutely, Matthew, and there was really a sense of shock here yesterday when all of that was announced, considering how high some of these tariffs are. The European Union 20%, as you said, China cumulatively 54%, and that tariff on foreign-made cars, which went into effect at midnight 10 hours ago, so such immediate action as well. And what we're seeing today is a sense of all of these erstwhile allies trying to figure out, what do they do now? Do they take sharp retaliatory action? Do they take a step back and try and see what's to come, try and negotiate, try and figure out what it means for their economies? Of course, those extra tariffs don't come into effect until next Wednesday, so there is a bit of wriggle room there. And the president himself mentioning that yesterday in that speech from the Rose Garden, that he expected foreign leaders to be on the phone to him trying to figure out a better deal for themselves. But he is resolutely sticking to this path. That is one thing we do know.
Take me through some of the political reaction there has been, because I saw a tweet from the former Vice President Mike Pence that was interesting, talking about the additional cost to the American average family of $3,500 per year. And then you had the Republican Senator Rand Paul describing tariffs and how they've decimated the Republican Party back in 1890 when it was first tried, and again in the 1930s. So take me through more of the reaction there's been.
Indeed. Well, we know there's no love lost between Mike Pence and Donald Trump since the events of January 6th, 2021. And he was very quick off the mark with that statement that you mentioned that he tweeted out there, calling this the biggest peacetime tax hike in American history. And there has been a lot of that, because essentially this is a tax hike on American consumers. And that's what we've heard from many in the Republican Party many of them quietly, I will say, not saying it publicly, but, you know, saying the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, is supposed to be the party against taxes. And basically, in levying these tariffs, which will be passed on to the American consumer, it is basically a tax. And as you say, Mike Pence working that out to be about $3,500 per American family, which is a huge amount of money when you think that there is still a cost of living crisis in this country. There are still people struggling to make ends meet. That huge issue that we saw on the election campaign last year hasn't gone away, hasn't been improved, and now prices are set to continue to rise, and potentially we'll see job losses as well. Already an announcement from Stellantis in Michigan, one of the big car manufacturers there, that it's to temporarily lay off about 900 workers and to pause manufacturing in its factories in Canada and Mexico, so an immediate impact. And then you mentioned Senator Rand Paul joining with Senator Mitch McConnell and Senators Collins and Murkowski to vote with the Democrats on a bill in the Senate tabled by former vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine to have a bill that would stop Donald Trump's state of emergency tariffs on Canada. Now, there's no way, well, almost no way that that's going to get through the House of Representatives, but it is a signal of that disquiet that is bubbling away there, and that will likely grow as consumers and constituents here express their disgruntlement and their dissatisfaction with these tariff moves to their representatives.
Katrina, thanks very much for now. We'll continue to talk throughout the course of the programme with more reaction, but let's head to Westminster. Let's speak to Damien Grammaticus, who's there for us. We'll also speak in a moment to Hugh Schofield in Paris and Arunadeh Mukherjee, who's in Delhi. And let us start, though, at Westminster, because in terms of the UK element to this, 10% tariff, so much for the special relationship. The government is, in a sense, tiptoeing around, trying to make sure a wider trade deal is signed. So two questions that come out of that. What is it that the Americans want the UK to deliver to bring that 10% down? And how long is the UK government prepared to have a stayed position on this?
Matthew, both very good questions, both we don't know exact answers to. What the UK has been doing is for the last few weeks engaging in negotiations with the US to try to minimise the impact of these tariffs. So disappointment today, the UK hit with the same minimum tariff as everyone else. But what the UK government is saying is it will continue to try to negotiate and see where that goes. It believes that businesses here support that. Question, yes, what might it be giving up? One possibility is reducing a very new tax that's been put on giant digital firms, Googles and Facebooks and the like, and that we know has been under discussion, that tax. But absolutely right, the pressure will be on Keir Starmer about how long he continues this for, and he has been meeting business leaders today and was then questioned about his approach. This is what he said.
We have to understand that just as with defence and security, so too for the economy and trade. We are living in a changing world, entering a new era. We must rise to this challenge, and that is why I've instructed my team to move further and faster on the changes I believe will make our economy stronger and more resilient. Because this government will do everything necessary to defend the UK's national interests.
Well, that was Keir Starmer earlier. Damien, Ed Davey has been talking about trying to introduce some sort of economic coalition of the willing. He's talking about two elements to that. One is a combined sense of retaliation, and the other aspect, he's talking about easing the friction of trade between those other partners, so the EU and various other blocs. Is there any sort of appetite at number 10 for anything like that?
Well, at the minute, the UK has been for some time engaging in talks with the EU about a new or removing some of the sort of frictions in the relationship there since Brexit. But essentially, yes, you have here the two different kind of approaches in front of the UK government. One, the one it's pursuing, try to do a deal with the US. And on the right, the Conservatives are saying, go for that. the other one, the Liberal Democrats, centre-left, saying we should absolutely have a coalition of of countries that want to defend free trade, should align ourselves with the EU, Canada and others, encourage more trade there, negotiate more with the EU to lower trade barriers with the EU, and that we should be going in that direction. At the minute, the UK government is following the opposite approach, but this will be a question I think that is going to be, as the pressures grow, as we see how this plays out, the UK facing a difficult situation, and particularly because budget pressures here, the government knows that slowing economy, impact of tariffs, reducing tax revenues is going to put it under even more pressure in future, and these questions will become critical.
Damien, thanks very much for now. Let's head to Paris and to Hugh Schofield. And Hugh, give me a sense of the reaction there where you are.
Well, a lot of nervousness, a lot of worry. President Macron right now is meeting with the heads of various sectors who are likely to be hit hard by this 20% tariff, which is going to come in. That's largely the food and drink sector. Big exporter, France, to the United States of wine, spirits, but milk products, pastry products, all of which are going to be hit hard. In the wine sector, we're hearing people saying, well, it could have been worse. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, Trump was threatening to put on 200% tariff on drinks from France and Europe because of the retaliation over another sector that is steel and aluminium. That has now, but it's going to be 20%, which was what happened before in the last Trump presidency. So in a sense, people say, well, we've been here before, we can gird our loins, but it's going to be difficult because the general context is different now. There are problems with China as well. So the drinks industry is in a very difficult state. The language coming out of the Macron government is very hard line. The government spokesman, Sophie Primas, talking about a new imperialism coming out of Washington. But I notice across Europe different tones. And I think certain observers are saying, well, this is exactly what Trump wants. He wants to divide Europe because you are getting some countries who are taking a more emollient approach, talking about the need for, putting up with this for the time being, going with the flow, not hitting back too hard, let him have his moment, and then we'll talk. Others are saying, no, the only language that Donald Trump understands is a language of force, so we should hit back hard. And Europe does have the means at its disposal now. For the last year or so, it's had something called the anti-coercion instrument, which is a way it can legally hit back under its own sort of, with a system now, to hit back at countries which it deems have pressured it unfairly on the trade front. It's used it against China already, and they're certainly thinking of a new round of retaliatory measures against America for the end of this month, hoping in the next days that can be averted by more talks.
And just briefly on this, Hugh, interesting what you're saying about whether there is or is not a unified approach. The Germans certainly want there to be a unified approach, using exactly the sort of levers that you were taking us through. But where is Emmanuel Macron on any sort of unified response on this?
As I understand it, he's quite hard line. I mean, that's why we had Sophie Primas, as I say, the spokeswoman, a few hours ago, talking this very, very tough language. Clearly, the line out of France is at the tougher end of the scale. Before all this happened, Macron has been saying things along the lines of, well, we respect America. I have a good relationship with Donald Trump, but he's got to understand that we won't take this lying down. That has got to be part of his understanding of how we operate here. So I think the French are certainly lining up publicly to hit back with tariffs, obviously through the European Union, because it's the European Union that will determine all this. But the pressure that France will be putting on publicly anyway is on the European Commission to come out with a new range of measures which may be aimed at digital services, certain parts of the the GAFA and all that, who are the X and the Metas and all this, who are in European eyes, undertaxed, if they're taxed at all here, that might be the first port of call, I think, for any retaliatory round.
Hugh, thanks very much. That's Hugh Schofield in Paris. Let's head to Delhi now. Arunade Mukherjee is there for us. And Arunade, give me a sense of the reaction where you are, because India hit with 26% tariffs as of yesterday.
Well, we heard from India's Commerce Ministry, which put out a statement a short while back in which it said that they were assessing the short and long-term impact of these tariffs. They were also in conversation with all stakeholders to really understand what exactly will be the implications, again, in the near and long term. They said, however, underlining that press statement by saying that we are currently in talks with US trade officials to still try to hammer out a mutually beneficial deal. So there is still optimism on the side of the Indian government that they will be able to hammer out something together in the coming weeks as well, as far as a trade deal is concerned. But one big highlight that came in was that the Indian pharma sector has been spared, which came as a huge sigh of relief because the US was one of its biggest export destinations. In fact, 90% of all prescriptions in the US consist of Indian generic drugs, which are available at much cheaper prices. So that was one of the big headlines that also came in.
Yes, I was reading that almost half of the generic drugs sold in the US in tablet form are made in India. So that's a significant exemption there. In terms of what some of the neighbouring countries have been hit with, their tariffs, which are higher, what is the view there in terms of how it impacts perhaps regionally?
I think this is where the story really is going to lie. This is where India is going to try and leverage its position as that viable alternative. Let me give you a few examples. Well, if you look at China and Bangladesh, for instance, the high tariffs there, can India's textile sector then fill that gap, increase its exports to the US, increase its market share? There's opportunity number one, according to experts. Opportunity number two, when it comes to increasing tariffs in countries like Thailand and Vietnam, what happens to the electronics and smartphone sector? Can India plug that gap? Can it play a crucial role as far as a market expansion there is concerned? Look at semiconductors, example number three, which the dominant player we all know is Taiwan when it comes to semiconductors. India is not a big player, but in terms of down the line supply chain, packaging, or other aspects of it, can India then plug itself in? So many experts who have been speaking to through the day after the news of the tariff hike came in said that, look, this could also be an opportunity as India looks to reroute and replan some of its trade options, some of its export options. And given the higher tariffs in the neighborhood, can India turn that into its opportunity? Can it turn it into some sort of an advantage for itself? In fact, I think that's where the story going forward is also going to be, as India also tries to hammer out that possible trade deal with the US.
Really interesting. Arunade, thanks very much. Let's head finally to Johannesburg and talk to Mayeni Jones, who is there for us. And Mayeni, just take me through the reaction there has been in terms of the tariffs where you are.
Yes, the South African government reacted first thing this morning to the news that it had been handed 36% tariffs on any goods that it exports to the US. The authorities here have expressed concern. They've called the tariffs punitive, but they say they still want to trade with the United States. After China, it's one of the country's biggest trading partners. So they say they want to negotiate a trade deal. This may be tricky for South Africa. It finds itself at odds with the US. President Trump has accused Pretoria of discriminating against white minority Afrikaner farmers here, descendants of European settlers. This is something that the South African government has repeatedly denied. But as a result of the dispute, the South African ambassador to the US was expelled last month. The US currently doesn't have an ambassador here. He hasn't arrived yet. And so diplomatic channels between the two countries are strained. Another country that's really felt the pinch is the small landlocked nation of Lesotho. It's surrounded by South Africa. It's been hit with 50% tariffs. Because the US administration says the trade deficit between Lesotho and the US is big and they want to try and address that. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. The authorities haven't responded yet, but they've said that they will speak within the next hour. It's unclear what they will be able to do because about 10% of their GDP comes from the exports that they send to the US.
We have to leave it there, but thanks very much for that perspective. Thanks to all of our correspondents giving us the fallout there after that dramatic announcement from Donald Trump at the White House yesterday evening. Do stay with us, plenty more reaction here in a few minutes' time. We'll talk to Ben Chu from BBC Verify, taking a look at how Donald Trump actually got the various percentage figures for all these different countries. We'll also hear from the car sector here in the UK. They, of course, already have been hit by a 25% tariff. So all of that are coming up in the next few minutes. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. You're watching BBC News. Let's turn to the Middle East now, because Hamas has rejected the latest Israeli proposal for the release of hostages and a ceasefire. Instead, the group is reaffirming its commitment to an alternative put forward by Egypt and Qatar. That mediated plan proposes a 50-day ceasefire and a step-by-step process for exchanging Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. In the absence of any agreement, bombardment continues. This afternoon, thick black smoke was seen billowing from the southern Gaza Strip, along with the sound of muffled explosions. The Israelis say they are establishing a new security corridor, which will divide Rafah from Khan Yunis and give Israel control of a second access in southern Gaza. Well, our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Knell, is in Jerusalem for us.
We know that Israeli troops are operating inside Rafah now, and the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister indeed, has talked about dissecting the strip to put pressure on Hamas to free the remaining hostages that it's holding. It's believed that 24 of them are still alive. What we've seen over the past few hours is more of this intense bombardment, both in the south of the Strip, also in Gaza City as well. And the latest figures that have come out for the past 24 hours from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza talk about 100 people having been killed. We just had a briefing a short time ago with the Israeli military spokesperson, and he was saying that there will now be this investigation into that incident on the 23rd of March when Israeli fire killed these 15 emergency workers close to Rafah. Their vehicles came under fire one by one in the early hours of the morning. They say that they were responding to an emergency call, people that were wounded, that there was gunfire in that area. A Palestinian paramedic who appears to be the only survivor has spoken to the BBC and really disputed the Israeli account of what happened. When the Israeli military spokesperson was talking to us, he said that now this investigation has been passed on to the general staff, so outside of the chain of command. He said that people would be held accountable if necessary, but Israel's initial investigation said that these were vehicles that were advancing suspiciously towards Israeli troops with no lights, with no emergency signals, they say, and they say that 9 members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad were killed, although they've only given the name of one of the Hamas members who they say was involved in the deadly 7th of October attacks on Israel.
Well, that was Yolande Knell, our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Now, Hungary is to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. The decision was announced in an official post on Facebook, with the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff saying the procedure will be initiated immediately. Well, it was timed to coincide with an official visit to Hungary by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is himself the subject of an ICC arrest warrant. Mr. Netanyahu arrived in Budapest this morning. The Hungarian authorities had already said the warrant to arrest him would be ignored.
We are
convinced that this has become a political court. In the past years, this was not a court of the rule of law. It is a political court. It is not owned by us. And this was most clearly shown by decisions related to Israel, and I do believe that an international court, mostly run by political intentions, cannot have Hungary participating in it. As a country that deems democracy important, I do believe that this otherwise very important court was diminished into a political forum, and we don't wish to have any part in it.
We're about to take a short break. When we're back, we'll have much more on the tariff story, international reaction. Emmanuel Macron currently meeting with business leaders in Paris. And Ben Chu from BBC Verify will be actually going through that list of the tariffs for individual countries. That's here in just a moment.